Do you believe that Donald Trump is unfit to serve as president and should be removed from office?
I believe that the act he took, an effort to corrupt an election, is as destructive an attack on the oath of office and on our Constitution as I can imagine. It is a high crime and misdemeanor within the meaning of the Constitution, and that is not a decision I take lightly. It is the last decision I want to take.
You talk about the consequences. You realize this is war. Donald Trump will never forgive you for this.
There's a hymn that is sung in my church. It's an old Protestant hymn, which is, do what is right, let the consequence follow. It's hard for me to imagine a more serious attack on the Constitution and on a republic like ours than saying that a president would be able to enlist a foreign government to corrupt our elections so that our president could keep in power. That's what happens in tin horn autocracies. It does not happen in the United States of America. And I felt without question that I had a responsibility, if I was going to honor the oath I made before God, to vote what I believed was right. And by the way, I trust my colleagues in the Senate did exactly the same thing, that they followed their conscience as they understood it. I don't argue with them. I reached my own decision without deliberation with them, but I'm absolutely convinced that this is exactly right, at least in my heart.
If this means the end of your political career?
Well, a friend of mine once said that the worst thing that ever happened to them politically had already happened. And the worst thing that ever happened to me politically was losing the presidency in 2012. I've got broad enough shoulders to be able to weather personal changes in my career, political or otherwise. But what I don't have is the capacity to ignore my conscience.
Again, do you believe that Donald Trump is unfit to serve as president and should be removed from office?
I do believe he should be removed from office. That's the vote that I will take.
Regardless of your political differences with Mitt Romney, at the very least you should applaud his integrity, which is only underscored by his own party's lack of it. And that's because, despite the overwhelming evidence proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Trump committed high crimes and misdemeanors, Romney was the only Republican to break ranks and vote to hold him accountable. This interview came on the heels of Romney's vote on the floor of the Senate to convict Trump for abuse of power in the aftermath of his attempt to extort Ukrainian President Zelensky into opening an investigation into Joe and Hunter Biden so he could use it as a soundbite to hurt Biden in this upcoming election.
So the verdict is ours to render under our Constitution. The people will judge us for how well and faithfully we fulfill our duty. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine. My vote will likely be in the minority in the Senate. But irrespective of these things, with my vote, I will tell my children and their children that I did my duty to the best of my ability, believing that my country expected it of me. I will only be one name among many, no more, no less, to future generations of Americans who look at the record of this trial. They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the president did was wrong, grievously wrong. We are all footnotes at best in the annals of history, but in the most powerful nation on earth, the nation conceived in liberty and justice, that distinction is enough for any citizen.
And while Romney's vote will undoubtedly reflect well upon him in the history books, what it does right now is highlight just how cowardly some of his colleagues' votes were. That Susan Collins characteristically waffled before ultimately falling in line with the rest of the GOP like she always does. Or that Lisa Murkowski or Cory Gardner or Martha McSally didn't even vote for witnesses, didn't even vote to give the impression of a fair trial, much less vote for a conviction. That these people, these so-called moderates, all voted to acquit a blatant criminal was made that much worse by the fact that Romney did somehow manage to find it within himself to not let a criminal get away with his crimes. But what's worse for Trump is that because of Mitt Romney's vote, this is the first bipartisan vote to remove a president in American history. The White House came in today bragging that the vote to acquit would likely be bipartisan, but with all of the Democratic swing votes, including Doug Jones, Kyrsten Sinema, and Joe Manchin, all voting to convict, as well as Mitt Romney, not only did Trump not get his bipartisan vote to acquit, but he got a partisan vote to convict. And so while Trump wasn't removed from office, the prevailing headline here is that even those in his own party acknowledge that he should have been. Now, because Trump is incapable of shame, he'll likely come roaring out of the gates, beating his chest and touting complete and total exoneration. But it's important to remember here that acquittal is not exoneration. That he managed to keep a bunch of partisan hacks in line, whose fear of Trump's Twitter feed is greater than their respect for the Constitution, is by no means evidence that the guy is innocent. It just shows that Republicans are incapable of putting country over party. That's it. It shows that despite the glaring illegality of Trump's behavior, that there's no act he could have committed that would have been enough to have them stand up for the rule of law. If anything, it's only rendered the rest of his party complicit in his impeachable offenses. So at Trump's next press conference, where he'll declare victory against the Democratic witch hunt impeachment hoax, along with whatever other synonyms he manages to glean from the latest episode of Hannity, remember that members of both parties found him guilty. Remember that a nearly unanimous spate of Foreign Service officers and U.S. officials testified under oath that Trump broke the law. Remember that Senate Republicans voted to bury witnesses and documents rather than allowing the American people to see them, which 3/4 of all Americans from both ends of the political spectrum were in favor of. And remember that Trump's buddies in Congress acquitting him doesn't mean he's innocent, it only means that they are cowards. And so while this impeachment trial has come to a close, that doesn't mean Trump's not on trial any longer. He is. He's on trial in every city and town and county and state across this country. He's on trial for every American who believes in the rule of law, who believes in the Constitution, who believes in decency, and who believes in fairness. So if you don't think that justice was served on the floor of the United States Senate, make sure you and your friends and your family and your neighbors are registered and vote him out of office just a few months from now.